James Thurber came from a family of non-mechanical people. He wrote once of an ancestor desperately trying to make something out of a malfunctioning butter churn, finally throwing up her hands in frustration and shouting at the universe, "Why doesn't somebody come here and take this goddamn thing away from me?" So it was for Thurber himself, especially with cars, as he annotates in this story from the 1945 collection, The Thurber Carnival. Recollections of the Gas Buggy, Footnotes to an Era for the Future Historian, by James Thurber. Now that the humorous magazines have taken to printing drawings of horses rearing at the sight of an automobile, and of children exclaiming as a car goes by, "What is that thing, Mama? Mama? What is that thing, huh, Mama?" It is perhaps not out of place to prepare some small memorial in advance of the passing of the motor car. It appears to have reached, on its way backward to oblivion, what corresponds roughly to the year 1903. I think that no one has drawn a darker or more vivid picture of the approaching doom of the gas engine than Mrs. Robertson, the aged washerwoman whose prophecies and pronouncements I have the privilege of listening to every Monday morning. Mrs. Robertson is, for my money, an extremely sound woman, although admittedly my judgment of soundness has sometimes been questioned. Some of the opinions of Mrs. Robertson which I recall offhand are these: "If you don't pay no mind to diseases, they'll go away. The night was made partly for rest and partly as a punishment for the sinful. And the government only allows you to keep furniture for 2 months. This last conviction grows out of Mrs. Robertson's habit of buying furniture on the installment plan and failing to keep up her payments longer than 6 or 7 weeks, with the result that the things are repossessed. She looks upon this recurring ritual in her domestic life as a form of federal taxation." Mrs. Robertson's beliefs and feelings about the future of the automobile, which I have been leading up to, go like this. The oil supplies of the world are being dried up in order to prevent future wars. This will also put an end forever to pleasure driving, but that's all right because if people kept on riding in cars, they would soon lose the use of both legs, and the life of man would pass from the earth. If Mrs. Robertson is right in her predictions, I would like to set down my own few unique experiences with gas-driven vehicles before I forget them. They may possibly serve as footnotes to the work of some future historian, lightening a little the dolorous annals of the automobile. Let me admit, to begin with, that the automobile and I were never in tune with each other. There was a fundamental incompatibility between us that amounted at times almost to chemical repulsion. I have felt the headlights of an automobile following me, the way the eyes of a cat follow the ominous activities of a neighbor's dog. Some of the machines I have owned have seemed to me to bridle slightly when I got under the wheel. Neither the motor car nor myself would greatly mourn if one of us were suddenly extinguished. Years ago, an aunt of my father's came to visit us one winter in Columbus, Ohio. She enjoyed the hallucination, among others, that she was able to drive a car. I was riding with her one December day when I discovered to my horror that she thought the red and green lights on the traffic signals had been put up by the municipality as a gay and expansive manifestation of the Yuletide spirit. Although we finally reached home safely, I never completely recovered from the adventure and could not be induced after that day to ride in a car on holidays. When I got an automobile of my own and began to drive it, I brought to the enterprise a magnificent ignorance of the workings of a gas engine and a profound disinterest in its oily secrets. On several occasions, worried friends of an engineering turn of mind attempted to explain the nature of gas engines to me, but they succeeded only in losing me in a mechanical maze of terminology. I developed the notion that the gas engine was more soundly constructed than I was. I elaborate this point only to show you on what unequal terms the motor car and I were brought together. Out of my long and dogged bouts with automobiles of various makes, there comes back to me now only one truly pleasurable experience. There may have been others, but I doubt it. I was driving in the British Isles in 1938 and came one day to a sudden coughing stop in a far and lonely section of Scotland. The car had run out of gas in the wilderness. This car's gasoline gauge had a trick of mounting toward full instead of sinking toward empty when the tank was running low. One of many examples of pure cussedness of which it was capable. There I was, miles from any village, with not a farmhouse in sight. On my left was a thick woods, out of which the figure of a man suddenly appeared. He asked me what was the matter, and I said I had run out of petrol. "It just happens," he told me, "that I have a can of petrol." With that, he went back into the woods and came out again with a 5-gallon can of gasoline. He put it in the tank for me. I thanked him, paid for it, and drove on. Once when I was telling this true but admittedly remarkable story at a party in New York, a bright-eyed young woman exclaimed, "But when the man emerged from the lonely woods, miles away from any village, far from the nearest farmhouse, carrying a 5-gallon can of gasoline, why didn't you ask him how he happened to be there with it?" I lighted a cigarette. "Madam," I said, "I was afraid he would vanish." She gave a small laugh and moved away from me. Everybody always does. Another experience I had in England the same year helped to shake the faith of at least one Briton in the much-vaunted Yankee affinity for machinery. The battery of my car had run down in a village about 20 miles from York, my destination. I put in a call to a garage, and a young mechanic showed up presently in a wrecking car. He said he would give me a tow for a few yards. I was to let the clutch in and out, or out and in, whichever it is, and start the engine that way. It is a device as old as the automobile itself, and years before I had managed it successfully. Any child or old lady can do it. So he attached a rope to the back of his car and the front of mine, and we were off. I kept letting the clutch out and in, or in and out, madly, but nothing happened. The garage man kept stopping every 500 yards or so and coming back to consult with me. He was profoundly puzzled. It was farther than he had ever dragged a car in his life. We must have gone in this disheartening manner about a third of the way to York. Finally, he got out for the 7th time and said to me, "What gear have you got her in?" I didn't have her in any gear. I had her in neutral. She had been in neutral all the while. Now, as any child or old lady knows, you have to have her in gear. If she is in neutral, it's like trying to turn on the electric lights when there are no bulbs in the sockets. The garage mechanic looked at me with a special look garage mechanics reserve for me. It is a mixture of incredulity, bewilderment, and distress. I put her in low gear. He gave me a short haul, and she started. I paid him, and as I drove off, I could see him in the rearview mirror, standing in the road, still staring after me with that look. After I got back to America, safe and sound to the surprise of my friends, I produced this same expression on the face of a garage man in Connecticut one afternoon. I had driven the same car from Newtown to Litchfield on a crisp October day. It happened that I was just getting over an attack of grippe and still running a temperature of a couple of degrees. The car, out of plain deviltry, began to run one too. The red fluid in the engine gauge on the dashboard started to rise alarmingly. It got to the point marked "Danger." I drove into a garage in a pretty jumpy state of mind. The garage man looked at the gauge and said the thermostat was clogged, or something of the kind. I was standing outside the car, staring at the dashboard and its, to me, complicated dials, when I noticed, to my horror, that one of them registered 1,560. I pointed a shaking finger at it and said to the mechanic, "That dial shouldn't be registering as high as all that, should it?" He gave me the same look I had got from the man in England. "That's your radio dial, Mac," he said. "You got her set at WQXR." I got into the car and drove home. The garage man stared after me until I was out of sight. He is probably still telling it around. My temperature rose a degree that night, and I developed a theory about my automobile. The thing possessed, I decided, a certain antic intelligence akin to that of a 6-month-old poodle. It had run a temperature that afternoon out of mischief and mockery because I was running one. It had deliberately betrayed me in the Scottish wilderness that other afternoon by running its gasoline gauge toward full instead of empty. I began to wonder what I had done to the car to arouse its malice. Finally, I put my finger on it. The car had probably never forgiven me for an incident that had occurred at the border between Belgium and France on a day in 1937. We had stopped at the Belgium customs on our way into France. A customs man leaned into the car, glanced at the mileage recorded on the speedometer, and said something in French. I thought he said I would have to pay 1 franc for every kilometer the car had traveled. I was loudly indignant in French and in English. The car had gone about 35,000 miles. I figured this out in kilometers. It came to roughly 55,000. And changing that figure into francs and then into dollars, still loudly and angrily, I estimated I would have to pay around $1,800 to the Belgian customs. The customs man kept trying to get a word in, and so did my wife, but I roared on to my peroration. I shouted that the car had not cost 1/2 of $1,800 when it was new, and even then it hadn't been worth 1/3 of that. I announced that I would never pay as much as $50 to drive the car into Oz or Never Never Land. Jamais, jamais pay. The engine, which had been running, stopped. The customs man finally got in a word. Dismissing me as obviously insane, he spoke to my wife. He shouted that he had said nothing about $1,800 or even $8. He had simply made some small comment on the distance the car had gone. As far as he was concerned, we could drive it to Jamais Jamais Pay and stay there. He turned on his heel and stalked away, and I started the motor. It took quite a while. The car was acting up. The night my fever rose, I thought I knew why. It had resented the slighting remarks I made about its value, and had determined to get even with me. It got even with me in more ways than I have described. Whenever I tried to put chains on a tire, the car would maliciously wrap them around a rear axle. If I parked it 10 feet from a fire plug and went into a store, it would be only 5 feet from the plug when I came out. If it saw a nail in the road, the car would swerve and pick the nail up. Once, driving into a bleak little town in the Middle West, I said aloud, "I hate to be stuck in this place." The car promptly burned out a bearing, and I was stuck there for 2 days. If Mrs. Robertson is right in her prophecy and the gas engine is really on the way out, it will be no dire blow for me. I will move within roller skating distance of a grocery, a drugstore, a church, a library, and a movie house. If the worst comes to the worst, I could even walk. Recollections of the Gas Buggy by James Thurber. See you June 20th.